My name is Mylynn Carter. I'm 23 years old. And 3 weeks ago, 2 strangers knocked on my apartment door, stood there under the hallway light, like they had every right in the world to be standing there, and told me they were my birth parents. I want you to actually sit with that for a second, the way I had to, because there was no lead up to it, no phone call first, no letter in the mail warning me it was coming. I had just made myself a cup of tea, and I was still holding the mug, still warm against my palms, when I opened that door expecting a delivery driver and found a man and a woman I did not recognize instead. I had never seen a photograph of either of them. I had never heard either of them described in any real detail, not their height, not their voices, nothing. And yet the woman said my name, my full legal name, the one printed on my birth certificate, not the name a single person in my actual life has ever called me. And then the man said the sentence I have not been able to stop hearing since. He said, "We're not asking. We're telling you what you owe us." And then, without a single breath of hesitation, he said the number. $40,000. I want to describe the rest of that doorway conversation exactly as it happened, because the details matter later. The woman, my birth mother, was smaller than I expected, dressed carefully, like she'd thought about what to wear to this exact moment. She kept looking past me into my apartment, not at my face, cataloging, I realize now, not greeting. The man, my birth father, did almost all the talking. He said they'd flown in from overseas 2 days earlier, and had been staying with relatives nearby. He said it like it was a small, unremarkable detail, not something that should have alarmed me, the fact that they'd apparently been in the area, near my life, for 2 full days before ever knocking. "You look healthy," my birth mother said at one point, in English that was more careful than fluent, like she'd practiced the sentence. It was the only thing either of them said that sounded even slightly like it belonged to a parent rather than a collector. I asked them, finally finding my voice, how they'd even found my address. My birth father didn't answer that question directly. He simply repeated the number, $40,000, and added that it was not so much, for family, a sentence that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since, because of how casually he said it, like he was discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a sum of money I would need years to save on my own salary. I didn't invite them in. I didn't say a single word back to either of them that day beyond one sentence, "I need you to leave." I closed the door slowly, the way you close a door when your hands are shaking too badly to slam it, the way you close a door when some old, buried part of your body already understands this is the beginning of something, even before your mind has caught up. I stood in my own hallway for a long time after that, the tea going cold in my hands, before I finally called the one person who had actually raised me. Auntie Wren didn't say much on that first call. I remember that clearly, because it was so unlike her. She usually has an opinion within the first 10 seconds of any conversation. This time, there was a long pause after I described the 2 strangers, long enough that I asked if she was still there. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, gone quiet and careful in a way I had never heard from her before, and all she said was, "Come over tonight. We need to talk about some things I should have told you a long time ago." I didn't understand yet how much weight was sitting inside that one sentence. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, the channel where ordinary people meet the moment that changes everything, and choose facts over noise, every single time. If you've ever had someone from your past resurface expecting something from you they never once earned, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me you're here, and stay with me until the very end, because what these 2 people wanted from me, and what they were willing to do to get it, turned out to be far bigger, far more calculated, and far stranger than a single knock on a door ever suggested. Let me back up, because none of this makes any sense without the beginning, and the beginning is not the story I actually grew up believing. I was raised in a quiet 2-bedroom house, just outside Sacramento, by a woman I have called Auntie Wren my entire life, and a man I called Uncle Desmond, her husband, until he passed 4 years ago from a heart condition none of us saw coming. For as long as I can remember, I understood my own situation the way a lot of kids in informal or blended families understand things, which is to say, in a soft, simplified version that adults hand you because they've decided, usually with good intentions, that it's kinder than the full truth. I was told that my birth parents, still living in China at the time, already had one daughter, and when a second daughter arrived instead of the son they needed to carry the family name forward, they made what I was told was a difficult, loving decision to let a relative here in the States raise me instead, because they couldn't afford a second child and wanted something better for me than they felt they could provide. I was 3 years old when it happened, too young to remember a single detail of it firsthand, and old enough now, at 23, to have built my entire sense of who I am around a story I never once thought to question. Auntie Ren was kind in the specific, steady, unglamorous way people are kind when they've quietly decided, without ceremony or announcement, to make someone else's entire life their responsibility. She never once made me feel like a burden she was managing. She showed up to every school event, every recital, every parent-teacher conference, sitting in the same folding chair every single time, like she'd claimed it years in advance. She taught me to cook the same 5 dishes her own mother had taught her, standing beside me at the stove correcting my knife grip more than she ever corrected my actual cooking. She cried at my high school graduation in a way that embarrassed both of us a little, and to this day, 20 years in, she has never once asked me to call her anything other than what I've always called her. She wasn't a stand-in for my real family. She was my family, full stop, and it never once occurred to me to interrogate the paperwork behind that arrangement, because why would you interrogate the one steady, unshakable thing in your entire life? There were small moments growing up, looking back now, that should have prompted questions and never did. I remember being maybe 9 years old, sitting in the back of Auntie Ren's car after a dentist appointment, asking her, out of nowhere the way kids do, whether my birth parents ever thought about me. She kept her eyes on the road and said, simply, "I'm sure they think about you sometimes," in a tone so even and practiced that I never once picked up on how carefully constructed that answer was, how much it was designed to close a door gently rather than open one. I remember another time, around 13, finding an old photograph in a drawer of a woman I didn't recognize, and Auntie Ren telling me it was a cousin, nothing more, before quietly moving the photograph somewhere I never saw it again. I didn't think anything of these moments at the time. Children rarely question the shape of the only life they've ever known. It's only now, looking backward with all of this new information, that I can see how much careful, deliberate protection was built quietly around me for 20 straight years, one small redirected conversation at a time. Uncle Desmond's death 4 years ago hit me harder than I expected, given that he wasn't, biologically, anything to me at all. He was the kind of steady, unremarkable presence you don't fully appreciate until a house goes quiet without him in it. He left a small inheritance behind, split modestly between Auntie Ren and me, enough to matter, not enough to change anyone's life dramatically. I used most of mine, over the following years, paying down a car loan and building a small savings cushion I was, at the time, quietly proud of. I never once imagined that same small, unremarkable cushion of money would eventually be the exact detail that drew 2 strangers to my apartment door. I work now as a lab technician at a regional hospital, mostly overnight shifts, running blood work and cultures in a quiet lab that smells like antiseptic and stale coffee, a job I chose partly because it's precise and orderly and doesn't ask anything emotional of me. I have a small 1-bedroom apartment, a car that mostly runs, and until 3 weeks ago, I had a family history I believed I understood completely, start to finish. That knock on the door changed all of it, but not in a single evening, and not in the way I expected walking into that first phone call afterward. It took weeks of careful, sometimes reluctant pulling at threads before I understood what I was actually looking at, and every single thread I pulled led somewhere worse than the one before it. The first thing I learned, within days, was the fact that should have been the single most basic detail of my entire life, and somehow wasn't. There was never a legal adoption. Not a formal one, not any kind. Auntie Wren had raised me for 20 years on an informal family arrangement. A handshake between relatives, and a handwritten note passed along at the time, nothing filed with any court, nothing recorded with any state agency establishing her, legally, as my parent in any capacity. Which meant that on paper, at this exact moment, 20 years later, the two people who had given me away, at 3 years old, were still, in the eyes of every government agency in this country, my legal parents. 20 years of being raised, loved, and shown up for by one woman, and legally, on paper, none of that relationship existed at all. I sat with that fact longer than almost anything else in this entire ordeal, because it meant the woman who sat in the same folding chair at every school event of my life had spent 2 decades with functionally no legal standing over me whatsoever, while the two strangers who'd shown up demanding $40,000 had never actually lost any legal footing to make that demand in the first place. The number itself, once I finally let myself sit with it instead of just being afraid of it, made no sense on its face. So I asked, through a cousin who agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to translate a follow-up phone call, exactly what the money was supposed to represent. The answer wasn't framed as a loan request. It wasn't framed as a gift, either, something they were hoping I'd offer out of goodwill. It was framed, flatly, as a debt, something I already owed them, tied to 2 specific things. A dowry they claimed they'd permanently lost the ability to secure, because they'd never had a son to carry the family name forward, and medical expenses from my own birth that they said they'd never financially recovered from in 23 years. I want to be honest about how that landed for me. It wasn't simply greed dressed up in a convenient excuse. It was an old belief system, the exact one that had already cost me my entire early childhood once, resurfacing 2 decades later with an actual invoice attached to it. What I couldn't figure out, in those first confused days, was simply how they'd found me at all. I hadn't been hiding, exactly, but I also hadn't been easily findable, no social media under my legal name, no obvious public trail connecting me back to a family thousands of miles away, that I had no active memory of. It turned out this wasn't a chance discovery, not even close. My birth father had been quietly tracking pieces of my life for close to 2 years, through a cousin, a relative I had genuinely never met in person, who happens to work in a completely different department, at the same hospital system I do. That cousin had mentioned, in what I believe she thought was harmless family small talk, passed along through a sprawling family group chat that stretched across 3 continents, that I'd recently come into a modest inheritance after Uncle Desmond passed away. That single, careless detail is what started the clock ticking. They hadn't come looking for a daughter they'd lost. They had come looking for money they'd heard about secondhand, through a chain of relatives, who had no idea what they were quietly setting into motion. I asked to see the group chat messages myself, eventually, and my cousin, feeling increasingly uneasy about her own unintentional role in all of this, forwarded me a screenshot. It was almost mundane to look at, buried between messages about a cousin's new baby and a recipe for dumplings someone was asking about. A single line, sent by my cousin 18 months earlier. Heard my got a bit of inheritance money after her uncle passed. Hope she's doing okay. That was it. That was the entire spark. No malice in the sentence itself, no ill intent from the person who wrote it. Just an ordinary, caring comment about a relative she barely knew, dropped into a group chat that, unbeknownst to her, my birth father had been quietly reading for years, waiting, I have to assume, for exactly this kind of detail to surface. It's strange, realizing that the thing that finally brought 2 strangers to my door wasn't some grand investigation. It was an offhand kindness, misread by someone with an agenda, sitting in a chat thread for a year and a half before anyone acted on it. While I was still trying to absorb all of that, Auntie Ren sat me down one evening at her kitchen table with an old showbox of paperwork balanced on her knees, and told me something I could tell she had been carrying alone, silently, for a very long time. She had been quietly sending money back, small amounts, a few times a year, for close to 15 years, to my birth parents. Not out of guilt over having raised me, and not out of any obligation she believed she owed them. She'd been warned early on, by relatives who understood the situation far better than I did at the time, that if the payments ever stopped, there was a real, credible possibility they would attempt to reclaim me, not out of love or regret, but as a child who could still be made useful to them in ways that were, unfortunately, not uncommon in the region and era they came from, whether as household labor, or eventually, as a marriage arranged for their own benefit rather than mine. Auntie Ren had been quietly paying, for 15 years, simply to keep me safe from the exact people who had just shown up at my door asking for more. I remember asking her, sitting across that kitchen table with the showbox between us, why she'd never told me any of it before. She looked down at her hands for a long moment before answering. "Because you finally had a normal childhood," she said. "I wasn't going to be the one who took that away from you before you even understood what you had." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to be angry that she'd carried something so heavy without telling me. A bigger part of me understood, immediately and completely, that she'd made that choice the same way she'd made every other choice about raising me, quietly, and entirely for my sake, never once for her own comfort. Somewhere in that same conversation, sitting at that same kitchen table, she told me something else I had never known, something that reshaped the way I understood my entire childhood in a single sentence. "I have a younger half-brother. He was born 2 years after I was given away, back in China, and unlike me, he was kept. He grew up hearing an entirely different version of our shared family story, one where, as far as I can tell, I was framed simply as the sister who left, the daughter who didn't work out, rather than the specific, painful truth that I'd been given away for the sole reason of not being a son." I sat with that fact for days afterward. I had spent 23 years as, in every practical sense, an only child, and there was an entire person out there who had grown up his whole life inside a story about me that wasn't even true. I didn't reach out to him first. He reached out to me, quietly, through a messaging app one barely used, only a few days after that first uncomfortable phone call with our parents. I expected hostility, if I'm honest with you, or at the very least, distance and suspicion. What I got instead was an apology, careful and clearly nervous, from someone explaining that he'd spent his entire life being told he had to represent the family's honor, to somehow make up, just by existing, for whatever they believed had been lost when I was given away. He told me, in that same message, that he was quietly terrified of our parents himself, and that this wasn't the first time they'd done something like this. There had been other relatives over the years, he said, people who owed them nothing at all, who'd been guilt-tripped, or pressured into handing over money under similarly invented justifications, dressed up in whatever language happened to work on that particular person. He wasn't the villain I might reasonably have expected. He was, in a lot of real ways, another person this same family had quietly used, just from the inside of the house instead of the outside of it. His messages, over the following days, kept filling in pieces I hadn't known I was missing. He told me our mother had a specific phrase she used growing up, whenever money got tight, or plans didn't work out, something that translates roughly to, "The daughter we lost would have fixed this by now," said not with grief, he explained, but with a strange kind of accusation, like my absence itself was the source of every hardship that came after it. He said he'd grown up resenting a sister he'd never met, before eventually realizing, somewhere in his early 20s, that the resentment had been handed to him on purpose, a story assigned to him before he was old enough to question who benefited from him believing it. "I don't need anything from you," he wrote at one point. "I just didn't want you to think everyone here saw you the way they do. That single message did more to steady me through the following weeks than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Around that same time, a family friend, who happens to be an attorney, agreed to look everything over for me, since a hospital lab technician's salary doesn't exactly come with a legal retainer sitting on standby for emergencies like this one. What she found changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. Buried in an old credit file, one I had genuinely never had reason to check before turning 23, there was a loan application from years earlier, one I had never submitted, never signed, never even known existed, filed using my full name and an old social security number, from back when I was still legally a minor. My birth parents had used my identity, without my knowledge or consent, to attempt to secure financing at some point during the very years I believed I'd had no contact with them at all. This wasn't an awkward, uncomfortable family request anymore, the kind you can talk your way through at a holiday dinner. This was identity theft, fully documented, with a filing date and a case number attached to it. My attorney, a woman named Diane who'd known Uncle Desmond from their college years, and had never once charged us a proper rate for anything, sat across from me at her small office, with the file open between us, and let me read it myself before saying anything. I remember scanning the same 3 lines over and over, my own name typed in a font that wasn't mine, an address I'd never lived at, a signature that wasn't remotely close to how I actually sign my name, not even in the same alphabet order. This isn't something people usually walk back from without consequences, Diane said carefully, watching my face. You understand that whatever happens next, this part isn't really a family disagreement anymore. This is a police report waiting to be filed, whenever you're ready for it to be. I wasn't ready that day. I told her I needed time to figure out what I actually wanted the ending of this to look like, not just what I was legally entitled to pursue. She didn't push. She just closed the folder gently and told me it would still be there whenever I was ready, which turned out to be one of the kindest things anyone said to me during the entire 3 weeks this unfolded. I want to be honest about the version of myself that existed in the days right after learning about that loan application, because it wasn't calm, not at first. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot before an overnight shift, running my thumb over the printed pages Diane had given me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which wasn't quite anger. It was closer to a strange, disorienting kind of vertigo, the sense that a version of me had existed on paper for years, taking out debt, building a financial history I had no knowledge of, while the actual me was going to school, learning to run blood work, building an entirely separate life that had no idea it was sharing a legal identity with a stranger's decisions. I sat with that feeling long enough that I was nearly late clocking in, and one of the nurses I work with, a woman named Denise who's covered more of my shifts than I can count, asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. I wasn't, not yet. But I got there. When I made clear, calmly, without raising my voice on the phone, that I wasn't going to be paying anything at all, the situation didn't stop. It simply shifted its target. My birth parents contacted Auntie Wren directly, and told her that if I continued to refuse, they would go public, within our extended family and community, with the truth that the adoption had never been legally formalized, strongly implying they still retained every right to reassert some kind of claim over me, and that they could make things seriously, legally complicated for the one woman who had actually spent 20 years raising me with no legal protection of her own. That's the exact moment this stopped being about money, in my mind, and became about protecting the one person in this entire story, who had never once asked me for a single thing in return for anything she'd done. That threat is what finally pushed Auntie Wren to tell me the last piece of this, the piece I think she'd been quietly holding back out of her own private shame. She told me she had actually tried to legally adopt me twice, once when I was 7 years old, and again when I was 14. Both times, my birth parents had refused to sign the necessary paperwork. Not because they wanted me back, and not because they had any intention of raising me themselves. Refusing to sign kept a door open they could walk back through decades later, exactly the way they just had, with their leverage still fully, quietly intact the entire time. 20 years of an informal arrangement wasn't simple neglect on anyone's part, the way I'd always assumed. It was a long game, deliberately held open, by two people patient enough to wait, until I finally had something worth coming back for. Once I had all of that laid out clearly in front of me, I finally asked, again through that same cousin, for an actual itemized explanation of the $40,000. I wanted real numbers this time, not vague talk of tradition, not vague talk of a lost dowry or medical debts from over 20 years earlier. What came back didn't hold up to even the loosest scrutiny. The figure bore no real relationship to any documented financial loss from my birth, or from any lost dowry decades in the past. It lined up, almost exactly, with a rough estimate of my current annual salary combined with the inheritance amount they'd heard about secondhand through that cousin's careless comment in a group chat. It wasn't a cultural debt at all, in the end. It was simply a number pulled from what they'd calculated I could realistically produce, dressed up afterward in language designed to make it sound owed, rather than simply wanted. I asked my cousin, the one still willing to translate for me despite what I imagine was significant pressure from the rest of the family not to, whether this had happened before, to anyone else. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she told me about a distant relative, a young man who'd moved to Canada for engineering work a few years back, who'd been approached with a similar request shortly after starting his first well-paying job, framed that time as compensation for schooling costs that had, according to the family's own records, actually been paid for by a scholarship, not by anyone in the family at all. He'd paid it, she told me, quietly, without a fight, because he hadn't wanted to be the one who caused a rift. I asked her if anyone ever pushed back the way I was pushing back. She said, after a pause, "Not that I know of." Not yet. That sentence has stayed with me since, because it meant whatever I chose to do next wasn't just going to affect me. It was going to be the first data point in a pattern that had apparently been running quietly for years, unquestioned, simply because nobody before me had the paperwork, or the nerve, or maybe just the specific distance of having been raised by someone else entirely, to ask for an itemized explanation instead of simply paying what was asked. I didn't confront them the way you might expect, and honestly, the way some earlier, angrier version of me might have wanted to. There was no shouting match, no dramatic phone call where I finally said everything I'd been holding back. Instead, my attorney arranged a single formal meeting, myself and Auntie Ren present on one side, my birth parents, and that same cousin, acting as translator, on the other. I sat there, calm, the way I imagine you have to stay calm when running careful blood work for a living, and I laid it out for them in order, one piece at a time. I told them exactly what we'd found regarding the loan application filed under my identity while I was still a minor. I told them exactly what we knew about the adoption paperwork they'd twice refused to sign. And then I gave them a simple, clear set of options, the same way I'd lay out findings for any careful report. They could cooperate fully in formalizing the adoption retroactively wherever it was still legally possible. They could disclose the identity theft to the bank involved and help correct the record. Or I would pursue every legal avenue available to me, fully, without a single further conversation. My birth father tried, once, to steer the conversation back toward tradition, toward obligation, saying something through the cousin about how a daughter's duty doesn't disappear, just because she was raised somewhere else. I let him finish completely before I answered. A duty has to be owed to someone who protected you, I said, and waited for the translation to land. You didn't protect me. She did. I nodded toward Auntie Ren, who hadn't said a single word the entire meeting, sitting perfectly straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap the exact same way they'd been folded at every school event of my entire childhood. My birth mother looked at the table after that. My birth father looked at my attorney's folder instead, like the paper itself, might argue back if he stared at it long enough. Neither of them looked at me again for the rest of the meeting. Nobody raised their voice in that room, not once, the entire meeting. That's not the ending you probably expect from a story that started with a stranger's fist on your apartment door. But it's the true one, and honestly, it's the ending that mattered most to me, more than any dramatic confrontation ever could have. They agreed to everything, eventually, though not gracefully. It took another 2 weeks of back and forth through Diane's office before the retroactive adoption paperwork was actually signed, and I remember the specific, anticlimactic feeling of receiving a scanned copy of it by email on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon between lab shifts. No ceremony, no music swelling in the background, just a PDF attachment finally making legal something that had been true in every way that actually mattered for 20 straight years. I printed a copy and drove it to Auntie Wren's house that same evening. She held it for a long time without saying anything, and then she folded it carefully back into its envelope, the same careful way she folds everything, and put it in the same showbox where she'd kept all the other paperwork, like it belonged there now, finally, instead of being the one document that had always been missing from it. The bank matter took longer to resolve, and honestly, is still working its way through a formal dispute process even now, but the identity theft has been reported, documented, and is no longer sitting quietly in a file waiting to resurface again in another 5 or 10 years the way it clearly had been for a while already. Diane tells me these things move slowly, and that slow, in this particular case, is actually a good sign, because slow means it's being handled correctly instead of quietly buried again. I didn't hand over a single dollar, not that day and not since. But I also didn't walk away from all of it in complete silence, because silence felt like its own kind of unfinished business, the kind I'd already lived inside for 20 years without knowing it. I reached out, quietly, to a small non-profit organization that works specifically with women affected by son preference practices in the same region my birth parents come from, women facing the exact pressures and the exact consequences of a belief system that once decided, calmly and without much discussion at all, that I wasn't worth keeping. I redirected the small inheritance I'd received from Uncle Desmond there instead, quietly turning the very thing my birth parents had heard about secondhand and come looking for into support for the precise pattern that had shaped the entire first 3 years of my life. The nonprofit sent me a short note a few weeks later, letting me know the donation had gone toward a small grant program for young women pursuing vocational training, the kind of practical, unglamorous support that doesn't make headlines, but quietly changes what a person's next 10 years can look like. I read that note twice. It didn't undo anything that had happened to me at 3 years old. It wasn't supposed to. It just meant that somewhere, right now, a decision that once cost me my entire early childhood was being used against itself, in a small, deliberate way, on my terms instead of theirs. My half-brother is still in my life, and if anything, we talk more now than either of us ever expected to, carefully, slowly, like two people rebuilding something out of pieces neither of us chose to break in the first place. He sent me a photo not long ago of a dish he'd cooked for the first time on his own, a version of one of the same 5 dishes Auntie Wren taught me at her stove years ago, a recipe that somehow found its way back into our family through 2 completely different households an ocean apart. It's a small thing. It mattered more than he probably realizes. My birth parents are not in my life, and I don't believe they will be again. That's not a wound I'm still bleeding from most days, if I'm honest with you. It's simply a door I finally got to close myself, on my own terms, after 20 years of it being left deliberately open by other people's careful, patient decisions. I still think about that knock on the door sometimes. The warm mug of tea still in my hands. The number, said out loud in my own hallway, like it was already settled before I'd said a single word back to either of them. I don't think about it with fear anymore, most days. I think about it the way you think about the exact moment you finally understood something that had been quietly true the entire time, and simply hadn't been named out loud yet. That's my story. One knock at the door I never expected. One number that never once added up under any real scrutiny. And one door I finally got to close, fully, on my own terms, for good. If this reminded you that the people who are supposed to protect you don't automatically earn the right to ask something of you decades later, take that as your sign today. Go check your own paperwork, all of it, even the parts you've never had a reason to question before. Ask the questions nobody in your family wants to answer at the dinner table. And if someone in your own life needs to hear this story tonight, send it to them. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. And I'll see you in the next one.